Hello there. Dame Jacinda Ardern said that the next generation's nuclear-free moment is going to be around climate change. But what's actually been happening in Parliament to work on that particular issue? That's what we're going to be looking at this week in the public gallery. Climate change is one of those topics that a lot of people get a bit upset and angry about. I don't know whether or not they feel like they are being blamed for it, or if they don't believe it, or there's a whole bunch of people who just get very upset when it comes to climate change. But we live in a world where man made climate change seems pretty obvious to a large chunk of people. And generally, the younger that you get, the more obvious it is that that is what is causing the issues. 2023 has been a pretty horrific year in terms of climate change related environmental issues. This year we saw the hottest temperatures on average for a month in Phoenix, Arizona of 40 degrees. 40 degrees a day Celsius for one city. In fact, July 2023 is the hottest month on record ever recorded on the entire planet. That's pretty extreme. We're seeing drought levels in Europe that haven't been seen since the 1600s, and Aotearoa isn't exempt from this. We saw earlier in this year, during the anniversary weekend floods and storms, events that were made far worse through climate change, the loss of at least 4 lives. 4 people. Cyclone Gabriel, when it hit in February, that was made worse by climate change, and that saw the loss of at least 11 lives, and one that was indirect and one person that's still considered missing. That's a lot of human cost for climate change. And we're now at a point where it feels kind of like we've fallen over the edge of the map a little bit, and everything we do is being made up, and we're trying to work out what comes next. When it comes to policy, though, and politics, this is where climate change activists get most frustrated. Because while I'm sure that they would like fast, sweeping changes to make sure that we do everything we can to save ourselves, that's not how Parliament works, and it's been a cause of frustration for a few parties, like the Greens, for example, which has seen regular issues crop up and regular attacks on the leadership of James Shaw because he's just not doing enough for some of their more out there activist members. But he's working within the system that we've got and the system that he's a part of. And he's had some successes. 2023 actually has the lowest level of greenhouse gas emissions from New Zealand ever recorded in the last 20 years. But it's going down, it's going in the right direction. But we're not going to hit our targets for greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2030 for a number of reasons. And then on top of that, you've got policies coming out from different parties this week about more roads and getting rid of public transport. And there's a lot of stuff there that for people who are most concerned about climate action, it feels like an attack. So this week we're going to be sitting down with Kelly and Dan and talking to them around climate. Both have really unique perspectives on this. Kelly actually works in an area that focuses on climate action. Dan, as an electrician, has started to see a growth in things like renewable energy sources being used in people's homes and what that means for people. But at the same time, they both have their own unique perspectives around what needs to be done, when it needs to be done. One of the other things I want you to take on board when we go into this conversation is the polling information. Not about who's going to vote for what, but how people actually perceive climate change. We've actually seen a perceptible shift in how people view climate change from 10 to 15 years ago, where it was this is something we can avoid, to now where most people would just like to find ways to mitigate living with it. Living with climate change. And that's a pretty big, bold statement. So let's have a chat to our panel and find out what their viewpoints are on climate change. Is it actually our nuclear-free moment? First, though, let's have a quick look at the history around climate change because it's quite fascinating. As far back as the time of Aristotle, there was actually beliefs put forward that men could change the climate in small areas. And they used examples like draining swamps and how that reacts and changes to climate from draining small areas as the examples that they used. But nearly 200 years ago, a scientist actually put forward the theory that aerosol pollutants were being mixed up with hydrogen atoms and getting caught in our atmosphere, seeing an increase in infrared radiation being captured within the Earth. 200 years. But it wasn't until 1896 that a scientist actually put forward a hypothesis with measurements around times, dates, the amount of carbon dioxide that we were seeing in the air, and the levels of it increasing, along with the temperature rising around the world, that we started to get real data sets that could be used to show that man made climate change was a really big issue. As technology has advanced through the last 150 years, though, we've been able to get more and more information about exactly what's happening. It wasn't really until the 1980s to the 1990s that the idea of global warming was really identified as the after effect from climate change to the way that we had pumped aerosols and pollutants into the atmosphere. And for a while there, scientists were actually divided as to whether or not this particular greenhouse gas creation was going to cool the earth or warm it. And that's where the term climate change comes from. Now we've got more information, and it's quite clearly obvious that what it's doing is warming the planet as carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases get stuck in the atmosphere. There were originally plans to do things like increase the amount of hydrogen in the atmosphere to try and disperse that. It turned out to be futile. That's not how it works. We're still constantly learning more and more about the human effects on the environment. And that's really scary. If you go to somewhere like NASA, for example, those changes, those man made changes to our environment and to our climate, are really laid out easily so you can see exactly what it is that they do and how we affect things. And it could be something as simple as changing the amount of oxygen producing plants on the planet while at the same time pumping a mountain of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So, moves to increase carbon dioxide output, like National's plan to increase the size of motorways and add new roads of significance, will ultimately have an effect of putting more pollutants in the air, long before we get to a point where electric cars apparently mitigate everything. Man made climate change is one of those things that is big and scary, and we've had lots of warning and lots of naysayers about it. But most people understand that there's definitely an effect on the climate that human endeavour has created for the last 200 years from the Industrial Revolution to today, which means, well, this is all our own fault, which is really problematic. But of course, there's also natural cycles of climate involved as well. So, one of the first things I wanted to ask both Daniel and Kelly this week was whether or not they believed man made climate change was a mitigating factor in what we see today and how our temperatures are rising and everything that's going on.
Yeah, I believe we've contributed to it, but there is a natural cycle over the millennia of up and down. But we've certainly sped it up.
Well, I believe that climate change is a natural process, has always happened, will always happen. But I also believe that human activities are exacerbating it, exacerbating the intensity of it and the speed at which change is happening.
The science is really clear on this one. Humans have had an effect on the environment around us and on the climate that holds the planet together. On average, between 1880 and 1980, we saw a temperature increase of 0.08 degrees Celsius for the global temperatures. From the 1980s onwards, that more than doubled to 0.18 degrees Celsius. That's huge. And a temperature change like that has huge, far reaching effects that we don't necessarily understand personally on a one on one level. Like it can change the way that water moves in oceans. And the ocean currents are really important for a huge number of reasons, like making sure that oxygen gets moved around in the atmosphere, or where clouds are going to go, how that affects weather patterns, and how things like food sources are going to move in temperatures that change. There's so much nuance to this. It's really hard to get your head around just how big a picture it is. Now, there's a really fascinating outlook, though, that this has brought on with people when it comes to our politics, because most people now agree yes, climate change is here and we've got to do something about it. But there's almost a line being drawn between do we do what we can to fight it or do we do what we can to adapt? Research that the National Party actually undertook in terms of what their audience wanted and what their voters wanted was climate policies that focused really specifically on adaptation. They think it's too late to do anything about it. It's too late to stop what's going on. So we need to learn to live with it. And that's a very hard thing to argue against when, personally, I've had 3 or 4 floods this year that have almost kicked me out of my house because of what's been going on. And I am by no means in the worst case scenario here. So I asked our panel members really specifically, is it time to adapt? Is that what policy needs to focus on? Or is it time to just fight harder and see what we can do to reverse the issues?
Well, I'd like to think both, but I don't feel as if we're doing enough to mitigate. Look, climate change and the crisis is already here. It's not going away. It's going to get worse. I don't think we're doing enough to make sure that we're resilient and that we can function and that food supplies can still happen as these extreme events still will continue to happen. We're certainly not doing enough, and not doing enough in terms of stop banks. We're not doing enough in terms of not building houses in stupid places. And I'm quite frustrated by the lack of that, because actually a lot of the solutions that could be put in place to make us more resilient in the face of climate change are things that make our life better anyway. There'll never be a waste of money to make a city more livable and accessible and for communities to be more connected. Yeah, extremely frustrated that that doesn't happen.
Well, there's certainly things we need to do. Like I think, yeah, in a way we're too late, but certainly reducing. I was going to say carbon footprint, but that's not the right word. Reducing waste. Anything we can do to reduce climate change, whether it's recycling or any mitigating the effects.
So, if the feedback that's coming in for the political parties is telling them that people want to learn about adaptation policies that focus on adaptation, what exactly has been promised so far? Now, at this point in time of recording, which is very early August, we're seeing policies being thrown out left, right, and centre from all of the political parties, and some of them haven't released policies around the environment yet. And so it's definitely something to take a look at a little bit closer to the time. But what we do have is a pretty clear line between left leaning and right leaning politics in terms of where they prioritise environmental policies. So the Green Party has a very strong focus on that for very obvious reasons. But even on the Labour Party policy page, the environment is the third on their listing of policy protocols that they want to focus on. But on the other hand, ACT has it right down the bottom of their list of policies, and it includes little changes like reducing MPs' flights by 25% and stopping companies from being able to dump waste directly into rivers. And that's not a bad policy at all. The National Party, however, has very little in terms of policy, and they're the ones that have done the work around what it is that voters want to hear around environmental policy. What they do have is wanting to focus on things like cleaner, greener electricity production through solar and through wind, and trying to promote people to use electric cars, while at the same time pulling back a whole bunch of regulations on the agriculture industry. And the agriculture industry makes up 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions in this country. So rolling back those regulations, that could have a really negative knock-on effect to what happens with our environment.
I think, look, I mean, we have things in place now which are supposed to be non-partisan or bipartisan, or whatever they want to call it. Um, but ultimately, I think every decision that we make for what we invest money in should go through a climate lens. So one of the things, like for example, here in Kirikiriroa, every decision the council make has to go through a lens, through a few different lenses, and one of those is climate. I think that should be the same for central government. For example, National made an announcement around billions and billions of dollars in roading. So, what's the impact of that on climate, and why isn't that something that is being discussed more? I know that they are looking at it from an economic point of view. Well, that's the way they said it's more productive if you've got the roads and all of that. It's just complete bullshit. And also, if you're thinking long term, what is the impact of putting all that money, which actually they're budgeted way under what even Waka Kotahi said, but you're putting all that money into the roading system. If we're serious about changing the way that we live our lives, we need to be investing in other things. So there's the loss of the money that could be spent on other things, but there's also the damage that's done by the decision that's made too.
Well, if they're saying, I'd get put off by a party if they're saying real dumb things around climate, like if they were saying they had some great policies, but said climate change didn't exist and we don't need to do anything. Well, no, they'd lose my vote, kind of thing. But everyone's kind of basically 80% of what they're offering regarding climate change is the same thing. Their approach to electric cars is wrong. There, I said it. The carbon footprint of the manufacturing is quite high. If they want to reduce energy use, they need to look at solar. We get plenty of sun. We can produce solar in this country to reduce the need to burn coal in some of our power plants, because we do.
At this stage as well, Te Pāti Māori have not released any policies directly related to the environment, but that's probably coming at some point fairly soon. And the only other party that has had recent polling high enough to get it into Parliament, which would be New Zealand First, have absolutely no policies whatsoever in regards to the environment. They do have policies like getting rid of woke name changes, but nothing at all directly related to the environment or climate change whatsoever.
Look, there are so many grassroots groups, community organisations, there's councils, there's iwi, hapu. So many of us are working towards resilience in the face of the climate crisis we already have, and climate justice as well. Um, so many of us, and we all come at it with the different motivations, the different areas that we are most interested in. But what I would recommend, and I guess the way that I know if a group is particularly impactful, is if they look like raging activists and radicals, pick them. Because I think at the moment it's too far gone for us to just be tinkering. If you're tinkering with things like recycling, you're not helping. It needs to be systemic change. It needs to be looking at the way that we invest in things. It needs to be in the way that we have decision making for how cities are built. We just can't focus on the individual stuff like, did this person, and look, transport emissions is huge. But fixating on whether or not somebody decides to take a car or not to work for climate action is fine, but we actually need to be focused on much bigger picture thinking than that. It can't be about the individual, it has to be about systemic change.
One of the more common arguments against doing very much to fight climate change is actually the size of the country. Aotearoa is a small island nation at the bottom of the world. What kind of impact could it actually have on fixing things? And it's kind of understandable when you look on a global scale exactly where we fit in. We make about 0.09% of all greenhouse gas emissions anywhere in the world. That puts us on par with Switzerland, which is about the same. Our neighbours in the West Island, Australia, they make about 10 times as much as we do in terms of total mass of global emissions. China makes up 32% of all global emissions of greenhouse gases, and that's because of their late stage industrialization. But China also has the largest massive infrastructure projects going on anywhere in the world around renewable energy sources. And it's really fascinating to see what some of their statistics are. While 1 in 6 new cars in this country that are registered are electric cars, it's 25 to 30% in China. They've got massive public works going on to create wind and solar powered generators. And once those kick in, they can pull back on their reliance on fossil fuels. So they're hoping to have a maximum peak in 2030, by which time the rest of the world, which has signed the Paris Climate Accord, is hoping to have reduced their emissions to 50% of their 2005 output. It's ambitious and massive. And there's often going to be people who sit there going, well, we can't make a difference. But for many, that difference starts at home. If lots of people are doing little changes, perhaps that will make a difference. Dan works as an electrician, and one of the areas that he's seen growing has been solar panels, because there's a couple of different ways that this can help you out. The big one, though, is how it can affect your bills.
People seem to be getting it to reduce their power, but also they've loaded their house up more. So we're just finished to install at the moment, and they've just got sort of standard house. They've got 3 kids, mother-in-law, in a separate cabin, and they're just like, how can we reduce our costs? They're seen as an investment. because the cost of power is going up, and also you get some benefit of the power they don't use during the day, they sell back to the grid. So you can get batteries and store it, and then you use it overnight. But then also, even with batteries, your excess that you generate, if you're not using it or not charging batteries, that'll be sold back to the grid. But it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. You pay anywhere from 10 to 17 cents a unit, and you pay, I think it's 25 to 35% per unit.
Oh, look, there's so much, and look, I work in this space. I've been in it for maybe 6 or 7 years. At this point in time, I should feel hope. I know we need to feel hope, but I feel really cynical. And I feel let down by people who should be making decisions for the betterment of all of us. And I've been sort of reflecting on why it is that there's a cognitive dissonance around. People know we have a climate crisis. They know the things they need to do, but do we do them? Not so much. So what's with that? What's with that dissonance? And part of me wonders if it's because we don't know what the future could look like if we were living carbon neutral or future. What does that look like? We can't envisage what it looks like to grow our own food and to look after our own communities. And sometimes the fear of the unknown causes inaction. And I feel like that might be part of the reason why so many people are just living the same, or doing the odd tweaks like recycling and patting themselves on the back, but not doing the hard shifts that we need to do. Life will be better if we can do those things, but we seem, yeah, stuck in a period of inaction.
When it comes to creating policy around climate change, there are actually a number of factors that do make it surprisingly difficult. There's a whole bunch of excuses that can be made, like we're a tiny little country in the middle of nowhere, or an individual doing the recycling isn't going to make a difference. But when it comes to actual policy creation, well, that's a lot more complicated. The Harvard Business Review actually did a great big report on this a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic hit, wanting to look specifically into why people found it really hard to sort of work around climate change and to get in their head just how important an element it is. And it came up with 5 really fascinating things to look at as to why people just kind of ignored it or chose not to get on there. The first one is something called temporal discounting. Basically, I can't understand what's going to happen to me in the future, so what's the point of dealing with it now? Now, when you look at something like climate change, which we know from the record books, the history that we've seen, and the research that's done, what we're seeing today is the result of cumulative effects. The human brain has trouble dealing with that. If it was something simple like, I'm going to put $5 a day away instead of buying a coffee, you know how much $5 is and every day how much that will add up to. It's really clear and easy to track. But something that you can't see the exact end result is much harder for a human to be able to identify, which becomes really, really problematic. One of the other factors that comes into play is that it doesn't happen to us. It's not a me problem. And up until fairly recently, a large number of New Zealanders had that same issue. In fact, I asked both Kelly and Dan whether or not they were affected by this year's storms. And, well, both being based in the Waikato, they didn't really have anything happen to them.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we were going on a tour around East Cape, around Gisborne, and it was got blocked off, so we couldn't go up around to the lighthouse, and so it affected our holiday essentially. Yeah.
No, I feel really grateful. In the Waikato, we didn't get any of the extreme weather events that other parts of the country did. But I'm aware that the way that we may have felt it, though it's really hard to pinpoint, is through the increase in food prices, and all other costs, of course, but they're more indirect and really hard to pinpoint to being a result of the weather events.
That whole idea of it being kind of abstract and how you get affected is actually another reason why it's really hard to see people take on board climate change as something of an urgent matter. And it's the same with politicians and politics. You see, it's a really big part of human nature to just sit there and go, well, that happens over there, it doesn't affect me. Sure, it might be 40-degree average temperatures in Phoenix, Arizona, where a woman can literally bake bread in her letterbox, but that's not happening to me. There are massive floods running through China at the moment, wiping out cities, but it doesn't happen to me. Italy is burning, wildfires in Canada, Australia on fire, but it's not happening to me. And that's a mentality that is very, very human. This year, though, as I said at the start of this episode, we got hit hard. We saw over a dozen people lose their lives because of the effect of climate change on our environment. And it's just going to get worse, which makes things really complicated for the next thing that Harvard reckons you should watch out for, and that's the fact that we can't tell what the future is going to look like. If you sit back and watch a movie from the 60s and their idea as to what 2023 is going to look like, it will be completely different to what's actually here. And it makes it really hard for us as a species and as individuals to plan ahead that far, particularly when you're dealing with something that has a cumulative effect, like climate change or fighting climate change. It becomes really difficult for us to understand and process how what we're doing now is going to have a bigger effect overall on the future. It's not like we're having a light bulb moment where suddenly everything makes sense and we've changed the future. I put the recycling out this week, and that's just a little bit less waste in a landfill, hopefully. These are really complicated issues, and they can be really draining at times. In fact, it's possible to lose hope, even for somebody like Kelly, who works at GoEco, who works at an organization whose job is to get people thinking about the environment and climate change. It's easy for somebody like her to lose hope.
Oh, look, there's so much, and look, I work in this space. I've been in it for maybe 6 or 7 years. At this point in time, I should feel hope. I know we need to feel hope, but I feel really cynical. And I feel let down by people who should be making decisions for the betterment of all of us. And I've been sort of reflecting on why it is that there's a cognitive dissonance around. People know we have a climate crisis. They know the things they need to do, but do we do them? Not so much. So what's with that? What's with that dissonance? And part of me wonders if it's because we don't know what the future could look like if we were living a carbon neutral or future. What does that look like? We can't envisage what it looks like to grow our own food and to look after our own communities. And sometimes the fear of the unknown causes inaction. And I feel like that might be part of the reason why so many people are just living the same, or doing the odd tweaks like recycling and patting themselves on the back, but not doing the hard shifts that we need to do. Life will be better if we can do those things, but we seem, yeah, stuck in a period of inaction.
One of the things I found most brilliant about this episode was a comment from Kelly, which really, for me, highlighted where we're looking when it comes to climate change. And it's that it doesn't matter if you do things that change the world for climate change and make the world better, the world is still going to be better, whether or not that climate change is real or not. It's real, it's totally real. Most scientists agree that it's real. But making a better world is not a bad outcome, no matter what the reason is that we're doing it. When it comes to climate change and the environment, we have seen directly in this country exactly how bad it can be, and we've only had a taste of it. We can expect hotter years, year on year going forward, and being able to adapt to that is really important as a species, as a group of people. And our politicians and politics need to focus on that because they're the ones who are making long term decisions that have an ultimate effect on the population of this country. And right now, they're mostly being kind of quiet on it.